Good afternoon. I'm Brad Crabtree, Staff Director of the Carbon Capture Coalition. Thanks for joining us today for the release of the Carbon Capture Coalition's policy blueprint. This blueprint recommends a portfolio of federal policies aimed at economy-wide deployment of carbon capture, removal, transport, utilization, and storage, all to help achieve net zero emissions and meet mid-century climate goals. We produced our first federal policy blueprint in 2019, and this updated version is significantly expanded in both scope and ambition. Importantly, this blueprint reflects a consensus of the over 80 companies, unions, and NGOs that participate in the coalition. We find ourselves in a very challenging time now, with deep partisan and ideological differences dominating politics and public policy in our country. In our current national context, this blueprint represents a striking level of agreement, one that's virtually unprecedented in federal climate and energy policy. It offers a hopeful and promising path forward. Despite our political challenges, the past two sessions of Congress have seen dramatic bipartisan accomplishments on carbon capture. First, there was the landmark reform and expansion of the 45Q tax credit in early 2018. This was followed more recently by the groundbreaking commitments in December that were enacted in the omnibus legislation. This includes a 2-year extension of the 45Q tax credit and over $6 billion in funding authorizations for carbon capture, direct air capture, and other kinds of carbon removal technologies, carbon utilization, and geologic storage. Now we find ourselves at the beginning of a new Congress and administration with growing support and fresh momentum for carbon capture. We have a critical window of opportunity to make further policy progress on carbon capture as part of broader infrastructure, COVID economic recovery, and climate legislation. For this reason, the release of this federal policy blueprint could not be more timely, and we have a great program for you today. First, my colleague at the Carbon Capture Coalition, Jessie Stolark, will provide a brief overview of the top-line recommendations in the blueprint. Jessie is Manager for Policy and Member Relations at the Coalition, and she was on point for managing the whole process of updating this blueprint and forging agreement among our diverse member companies, unions, and NGOs. Jessie will be followed by a terrific panel featuring coalition participants, all who have a deep commitment to ensuring that carbon capture achieves its full climate, jobs, and economic potential. I will introduce each of our panelists after Jessie's presentation. Now I'll turn it over to Jessie.
Thank you, Brad. As Brad mentioned, I'm Jessie Stolark. I'm the Public Policy and Member Relations Manager for the Carbon Capture Coalition. You can go to the next slide, please. So the coalition is a nonpartisan collaboration of more than 80 businesses and organizations working together to build federal policy support for economy-wide deployment of carbon capture, removal, transport, use, and storage. As Brad mentioned, we are a deeply bipartisan coalition, all working in common cause to support the deployment of carbon capture technologies through enabling federal policy. Next slide, please. So when we refer to carbon capture, we are really referring to the entire suite of carbon management tools, which includes and ranges from carbon capture of both carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, removal through direct air capture, transport and utilization in products, or through secure geologic storage. Our 2021 blueprint builds on the framework established in the 2019 blueprint and contains updated policies, framework, and increased ambition for the 117th Congress. The blueprint contains a policy framework to advance carbon capture deployment to meet mid-century climate goals, foster domestic energy and industrial production, and provide jobs that consistently pay above prevailing wages. While 45Q is still the keystone policy for carbon capture deployment, a full suite of policies are needed to maximize the impact of the 45Q tax credit, facilitate the build out of CO2 transport and storage capacity, and increase federal investment in carbon management technologies. Next slide, please. Before I move to the specific policy recommendations contained with the blueprint, I will touch on why we need to deploy carbon capture technologies and what kinds of economic development opportunities these projects can provide. For climate, both the IPCC and the IEA assert that economy-wide and accelerated deployment of carbon capture is critical to achieve global temperature targets. In scenarios to limit warming to below 2 degrees, the IEA concludes that 15% of all emissions reductions to meet net zero by 2070 must come from carbon capture. If we increase our climate ambition and move the net zero goalpost up to 2050, IEA estimates that we will need to deploy an additional 50% more carbon capture technologies. So translating those numbers into actual facilities, the IEA estimates that carbon capture will need to scale to over 2,000 facilities, capturing 2.8 gigatons of CO2 per year to meet these mid-century goals. And if we look at the IPCC's more ambitious 1.5 degree scenario, they estimate that anywhere between 8 to 15 gigatons of annual emissions reductions this century must come from carbon capture alone. More than half of that will come from carbon removal. And these are in the IPCC scenarios that assume other emissions reduction strategies as well. Next slide, please. So if we look at the jobs and economic development potential from carbon capture, deploying these technologies at industrial facilities, power plants, direct air capture, and the associated buildup of CO2 transport networks is a significant source of high-wage jobs in industry, manufacturing, and the energy sector. These projects can provide some of the most desirable clean energy jobs and energy and industrial jobs, since employment in these sectors pay higher than average local wages while preserving facilities and infrastructure. The blueprint contains new information on the potential jobs associated with carbon capture projects across sectors. Additionally, analysis from the Rhodium Group has found that the buildup of a carbon management industry in a 21-state region can support approximately 68,000 project jobs and nearly 39,000 operational jobs, all while capturing over 590 million metric tons of CO2 per year. Next slide, please. So as Brad mentioned, the revamped and updated 45Q tax credit was a tremendous bipartisan accomplishment and still remains the cornerstone policy for carbon capture deployment. Since the passage of the Future Act in 2018, we've already seen the public announcement of at least 30 carbon capture projects spanning industry, power, and direct air capture that will securely store CO2. These projects are an essential early down payment on long-term deployment of carbon capture. And if all of these projects are commercialized, it will represent a tripling of operational facilities in the United States. However, it's also become clear in the 3 years since the passage of the Future Act that we will need a full portfolio of policies beyond 45Q to properly incentivize and deploy these technologies to meet mid-century climate goals. Next slide, please. So the policy blueprint outlines a comprehensive and ambitious agenda for delivering on carbon capture's multiple potential benefits. And it also contains special consideration of the policies needed to commercialize in key sectors, including heavy industry, electric power generation, and direct air capture, which are critical to achieving these mid-century goals, but face significantly higher costs for deployment. So as you'll see in our lovely graphic here, in the 2021 blueprint, we have divided our policy platform into 4 areas. Policies to provide further certainty to investors and project developers, utilizing federal research and development capacity to further further technology cost reductions, scaling the necessary infrastructure to transport and appropriately store or utilize CO2, as well as building markets for products sourced from carbon capture. And then finally, ensuring that benefits from carbon capture deployment flow to communities most impacted by climate change and air pollutants. Next slide, please. So starting with our first bucket, investment certainty, project finance, and feasibility. Overall, our top 2 legislative priorities as a coalition for the 117th Congress are enacting a direct pay mechanism for 45Q and a further multi-year extension of the 45Q commence construction window. As Brad mentioned, the fiscal year 2021 omnibus was a tremendous bipartisan achievement, and it included a 2-year extension of 45Q commence construction deadline, but much more is needed to scale these technologies over the next decade. On our top priority, direct pay is a more straightforward, efficient, and effective means of financing carbon capture projects. Looking at a multi-year extension beyond the recent 2-year extension, that's needed to provide certainty to project developers who are undertaking these complex projects that can take multiple years before they start construction. In addition to these 2 top priorities, in the financing side of things, the blueprint also explores a menu of options that would further enhance the ability to monetize 45Q and close cost gaps that remain between the level of support provided by the policy and the cost of commercializing these technologies, particularly in those sectors where capture costs are higher and there are not yet any commercial scale projects. And I'll just mention that this includes a per megawatt hour production tax credit alternative to 45Q for natural gas power projects, but there are a lot of other ideas that you'll see in the blueprint. Next slide, please. On research and development, the federal government has played a key role in the development of early stage and mature carbon capture technologies. And the fiscal year 2021 Omnibus scales new research and development programs for carbon capture technologies. Overall, carbon capture programs in the Omnibus saw a historic increase to authorized funding levels. However, these new authorizations really are a course corrections in terms of federal investment in these technologies. And in particular, in the Omnibus, I wanted to draw your attention to the $4.7 billion for the newly authorized carbon capture technology program, which includes $2.6 billion for commercial scale demonstration projects. Importantly, this commercial demonstration money is also no longer restricted to first of kind projects, but will allow for the demonstration of up to third of kind in a variety of industry, power, and direct air capture applications. Next slide, please. With regards to transport, storage, and market development, we have a couple of high priority recommendations. Increasing.
I apologize to everyone. The perils of our virtual world. Where was I? So I was talking about the need for enabling policy for CO2 transport and storage. You know, increasingly that need is being recognized by other governments. However, in the United States, we don't have any equivalent policies. But to that end, at the end of the last Congress, a group of bipartisan representatives introduced the Storing CO2 and Lowering Emissions Act, or SCALE Act, which is a step change in how the federal government approaches the financing of the necessary transport and storage infrastructure networks. And it would provide low interest grants and loans to build the necessary transport and storage infrastructure networks throughout the country. Enactment of the SCALE Act is, I would say, a high priority for the coalition this Congress as well. On the permitting side, it is also crucially important that we ensure that projects are permitted in a timely manner. On the project map that I showed you earlier, over half of the 30 projects in the development pipeline have declared the intent to store CO2 in dedicated saline geologic storage sites, but currently there is only one permitted and operating Class 6 well in the United States today. So it's crucially important that we build up our ability at the federal and state level to timely and appropriately permit these projects. And then finally, this Congress, we will be looking increasingly towards the federal government's role in the public and private procurement of products sourced from carbon monoxide and CO2, which includes a diverse array of products. Next slide, please. So just to wrap things up, our last policy area is centered on jobs, economic development, and affected communities. This is a new topic for the Coalition's policy blueprint, and we anticipate the Coalition will be making further recommendations on these topics during the 117th Congress. We have two initial topics we are considering in this area. First is ensuring that the jobs created and retained from development of a carbon management industry flow equitably to communities and regions. As a start, we will be examining apprenticeship and other training programs that the federal government can bolster to provide workforce development for these projects. We also want to ensure that the development of carbon capture projects addresses local air quality and other pollutants. Carbon capture has a role to play in addressing these concerns, and in many cases, retrofits and carbon utilization can significantly reduce conventional pollution emissions. However, we need to better quantify the potential air quality benefits from carbon capture retrofits, and we see a federal role here as well. So that's our brief overview of the federal policy blueprint, and I hope we'll tee up further discussion for our panel. With that, I will hand things back over to Brad, and sorry for the technical difficulties.
It's great. Actually, thank you, Jesse. You finished right on time in spite of being cut off. I'm impressed. So we'll turn to our panel now, and I'll begin by introducing our speakers, starting with Colin O'Mara. Colin is President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. He's also a former Secretary of Natural Resources for the state of Delaware and a well-recognized national conservation leader. For the purposes of our event today, he's also a passionate advocate for carbon capture as a climate solution. We will also have on the panel Corey Shannon, who is Special Assistant to the President on Climate for the Boilermakers Union. Corey is actually based in Canada. The Boilermakers are an international union, also very involved in activities here in the US. He's led a number of innovative and successful efforts to raise awareness about the need and jobs benefits of carbon capture on behalf of his union in North America. And then Laurel Harmon is Vice President of LanzaTech. LanzaTech is a really innovative global company that is building a global business model around transforming captured carbon into fuels, chemicals, and other valuable products. Laurel's also a professional scientist, and she's been a tremendous resource for the coalition in bringing her technical expertise to our work in developing policies. So I'm going to start by giving each of them a chance to offer some opening remarks, talk about why their organizations and company are involved in the Carbon Capture Coalition. And Colin, let's start with you. And in addition to that general intro, perhaps you can give us some perspective on why a conservation organization like the National Wildlife Federation sees carbon capture technologies and the policies outlined in this blueprint as playing an important role ensuring that we protect wildlife and wild places.
Great, no, thanks, Brad. And it's good to be with you, Laurel. Good to be with you, Corey. We're excited to be part of the coalition. And look, I mean, at the end of the day, there is no way to meet the level of emission reductions we need to get anywhere near net zero without robust carbon capture technologies. And so, for the National Wildlife Federation, an organization that was founded in 1936 to try to make sure we have healthy wildlife populations, now the greatest threat right now to many species, in some places it's habitat, but in a lot of places it's climate. We have to be pragmatic and kind of very clear-eyed about the technologies that we're going to need to achieve that future. And it's not simply in the power plant sector. I mean, so often the carbon capture conversation focuses on power, on the electrical sector. I mean, frankly, I don't know how you get close to reducing the 21% of emissions from the industrial sector without having robust investments in carbon capture. And I'm just really grateful for the coalition's work over the last few years to evolve, to kind of think through a range of technologies that can help sequester carbon and create a carbon economy where we can actually use these molecules for productive use instead of having them kind of contaminate the overall balance of the climate equation. I also think, obviously, as a wildlife guy, right, I also think there's natural solutions as well that can play this role. But I mean, we're all in on these conversations specifically because I want to have a future where we not only reduce emissions, but we're still making things in this country, where we're manufacturing at scale, that we have products that are less carbon intensive, that we have great union jobs that are robust in places like my hometown of Syracuse, New York, and my current kind of home in Delaware, where folks have a way to work and have cleaner energy and at the same time well made American products. And I think the carbon capture solutions that we're talking about today, during a pandemic, during a time when the economic recession is leading to mass unemployment, that we're going to need vehicles that we can drive real investment and really make these investments up front. And I'll just end with this. I mean, if there was ever a time for this conversation to get serious, it's when the Congress is talking about spending, $4 trillion potentially on infrastructure as a way to really have an industrial policy for the first time in 40 or 50 years, as a way to make all the climate promises that we've been talking about for years actually have a trajectory to get to not only net zero, but hopefully, an incredible down payment by 2030 or 2035. This is a time for serious people, and this is a serious conversation. So I thank everybody for being here.
Colin, thank you, and thanks for a great opener to our conversation today. Corey, let's turn to you. You've been on the, Colin mentioned jobs as an important purpose and benefit of widespread deployment of carbon capture. You've been on the forefront of advancing carbon capture for energy, industrial, and construction trade jobs. Tell us a little bit about why you're in this effort and how you see these policies being at the center of a jobs agenda.
Great. Good morning and good afternoon, whatever part of the country or the world you might be in watching this this session. And thank you, Brad, for the kind introduction. And also, I really have to thank the Carbon Capture Coalition for the hard work that you folks have done. And this is really one of my first opportunities to participate with the coalition and look forward to fostering and growing and building bridges, not just here, but abroad, because this is a very important message. This isn't something that's just regional or part of the United States or Canada. This is a global issue. So we all have much more hard work to do, but we're all rolling up our sleeves and looking forward to that. But anyways, my name's Corey Shannon. I'm a Boilermaker member for 35 years. I've had the privilege to be in this role of advocating for carbon capture for the last few years. But nonetheless, the organization that I work for and represent has been around since 1880. And we've been part of installing pollution controls in different industrial facilities since the 50s for particulate control on electrostatic precipitators. We were involved with mitigating SO2 reductions and utilizing flue gas desulfurization technology when we were fighting in the challenges of acid rain several years ago. So it's just been a natural fit for our organization, as diverse as it is, and working in the vast different industries throughout North America. It's a perfect fit for us to be engaged and involved, and we're certainly prepared to help in any way we can. I think, you know, it speaks volumes of the sheer size of this coalition. I mean, with 80 participating organizations and several people observing, I mean, this is truly a strategic alliance of organizations and influencers who all believe in innovation and technology, whether it be point of source or direct air capture. We all care about the environment, but we also care about well-paid jobs, and we care about the economy, stable economy. Remember that for every direct energy job that's out there, it's supporting 3 to 4 indirect jobs. No one's talking about that, but of course, you know, with energy instability, we have to bear in mind that we have to pay attention to the whole vast scheme of job opportunities. You know, as nations go through COVID recovery, what better place to spark and ignite that investment is in its energy industry, and adopting innovation technology such as carbon capture to stabilize the economy. And remember this, that the future is not going to be resource free, it's going to be resource intensive, but it will be low carbon. And we're going to be part of that solution. So we're very pleased to be here today. And thank you again, Brad.
That's great, Corey. Thank you for joining us. Laurel, your turn to you. Your company, everybody's talking about the new carbon economy, and your company is at the heart of that, capturing carbon monoxide from steel plants or CO2 in other contexts and transforming what are, in a sense, waste gases into products, including jet fuel, chemicals, and so forth. Tell us a little bit about how this federal policy blueprint and the priorities and policies in it can help advance the business model of your company.
Absolutely. First, let me start off by saying thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be part of this panel. You know, I think the panelists here reflect the diverse membership of the coalition, which, as far as we're concerned, is one of the really key aspects of this coalition, that it's bringing together environmental groups, labor, industry, to focus on this incredibly important topic. So as you know, what we do is biological carbon capture and utilization. This technology is already being deployed at commercial scale in China. We have produced over 20 million gallons of ethanol, our first commercial product, directly from steel mill gases, just so that people understand this isn't science fiction, but it's real. And our goal is to bring that technology to the US. We see this as a way to create a fully circular economy that's based on carbon. So instead of looking at this carbon as a liability, looking at it as a resource, as a source, not only for new jobs, but for new materials, new fuels that replace things that we normally get today from oil and natural gas. And just as an example, ethanol from that plant in China has been used, as Brad said, to produce jet fuel, which has been used in transatlantic and trans-Pacific flights. It's been used to make packaging for household products. It's been purified and used in cleaners, household cleaners, which are on shelves in Europe today. So this is truly a way to start connecting supply chains that are all based on carbon capture and utilization. So what we see in the blueprint is it recognizes not only that there's a need for a portfolio of policy measures, as we've heard about earlier today, but a portfolio of solutions. And so we see it as really these measures are important to grow up an entire economy-wide focus and industry based on carbon capture, transport, utilization, and storage. And some of the measures that are out in the blueprint will promote the early stage R&D all the way through, as you heard, those large scale deployments, which we need in order to achieve our objectives quickly enough to make an impact. For us directly, the measures that are focused on improving project economics, providing incentives, and also those which will incentivize markets for carbon capture products and put them on par with some of the other incentivized products in the US market. Those are all very, very important. So we really look forward to working with everyone in the coalition to advance this further.
Great, thank you, Laurel. We have several questions now for the panelists, and I'd just like to let everybody know in the audience, after these, we're going to give our three panelists a chance to respond to these questions. And then after that, we'll be taking your questions. As you think about them, please put them in the chat, and Jesse will be helping us to field those questions. So in his intro remarks, Colin, I don't want to exactly quote you, but you said something to the effect of, now is a serious time for serious people. And I think we all feel that in the coalition right now, that we are in a unique moment that may not come again for a generation or more. So let's get down to brass tacks, and I'll ask each of you, and we'll go in the same order that we had the opening remarks. So what steps should the Biden administration and Congress be taking to ensure that we make progress rapidly on realizing economy-wide deployment of this full suite of carbon capture technologies? Again, it's carbon capture, direct air capture, CO2 transport, carbon utilization, and geologic storage. And then in that context, sort of what are some of the legislative vehicles that you're looking towards for lawmakers to take advantage of in moving some of these policies forward? And Colin, let's start with you, and Corey and Laurel can follow and answer as you feel comfortable.
Great, no, thanks, Brad. And when the president thinks about the kind of the four historic crises that we're facing right now, right? The pandemic, the economic recession, the racial reckoning, and the climate change. He's looking at solutions that simultaneously address all four, and also do it in ways that create massive numbers of jobs in equitable and just ways. And so, after we get through the COVID package in the next 3-4 weeks, hopefully, then we'll have a State of the Union where he will talk explicitly about rebuilding the economy in a more fair way that it creates a lot more opportunity. And he'll be giving that speech at a time when the unemployment rate is misleading at this point, to be generous, just given the number of folks that are furloughed or working part-time or underemployed. But tens of millions of folks are struggling right now. And so what better way to invest in our economy than to do so through investments that rebuild our capacity to make things in this country again and make things in cleaner ways, whether those are electrons or their products. And so I think, come end of March, beginning of April, this is going to be the conversation. How do we best invest at scale, and how do we invest in ways that leverage private capital? How do we make sure that different tax structures actually work to induce capital for investment, just given the lack of tax appetite, just given the recession and previous tax cuts? But making sure these vehicles are real, right? Making sure that they're going to drive real change. At the same time, you're going to see a huge focus on innovation and making sure that the next generation of technologies, and obviously a lot of carbon capture today is going towards enhanced oil recovery, but there's a whole suite of solutions that are out there that are right around the corner, and pilot projects and things that Laurel's working on, and others that are ready to go and could get scaled up. And so I think that's really, really encouraging. But I think the vehicle is going to be the infrastructure package. There may be other vehicles later, but that is going to be the biggest place to show how this suite of solutions intersects, because we're talking largely about tax measures in some cases, and investments in R&D. These are investments that will meet the Byrd rule, not to get too technical for folks, but if it is a reconciliation environment, these are solutions that actually could fit into the kind of fairly narrow rules about what qualifies for that vehicle. And so I think it's really set up in a way that lends itself to making a broad range of solutions. And the other two pieces I would just add to the equation. There was an executive order that the president took a little while ago on procurement. Again, using the buying power of the federal government. So having good incentives, good direct spending, but then also using the procurement power, huge opportunity for cleaner, we've talked about low carbon cement. We've talked about all kinds of different, kind of carbon captured products as being part of the solution. And then the other piece too is linking this to the manufacturing conversation. There are places like I grew up in the Rust Belt, and obviously places that we would love to have reindustrialize to create a lot of jobs. And so combining the conversation around 45Q with conversations around 48C, which is kind of an advanced manufacturing credit, again, creates real opportunity to bring back jobs in places that have been hardest hit. I would love to see massive investment in Appalachia, in the Rust Belt, in the Permian Basin, up in the Powder River Basin, places that are facing massive unemployment right now. Communities that have powered this country, workers that were the veterans that, energy veterans that, made a kind of America the superpower that it is, like driving investments through an intentional strategy in ways that also meet all of our other goals is transformative. Frankly, we've never seen anything like this in my lifetime, at least. I mean, this is going to make the recovery package from 2009 look like peanuts if we do it right.
Great thought, Colin. Thanks. The moment we're in is almost reminiscent of, for example, the 1930s in terms of the scale of change we're looking at. Corey, let's turn to you. Oh, you're on mute, I think, Corey, or there you go.
Thank you, Brad. As a Canadian, it's difficult for me to judge any other government outside of my own country, but I will say this, that clearly you have prepared this policy or this blueprint that offers hope. And that's what people are looking for. They're looking for some hope. They're looking for stability in the economy. They're looking for the mitigation of all the environmental challenges that we have. It's really the framework that's needed for the decision makers to develop models and well-researched papers that will provide for that win-win-win story that everyone is looking for. This story is about achieving meaningful emission reductions while preserving well-paid, meaningful jobs. And in fact, producing further employment opportunities and stabilizing the economy. There's no other technology that will mitigate greenhouse gas emissions like carbon capture. We hear this from the IEA and the IPCC. So when we all look at these recommendations from the International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's blueprints like this that add to that momentum of positive solutions for the energy industry and all the environmental challenges we have. So this is just another tool in the toolkit that, us as influencers and advocates over innovation technology need to push and work very hard to not just convince our political leaders, but also convince the public out there, because it's the public's opinion that drives the opinion of government. So I think this is just a fantastic tool, again, in the toolkit that's very much needed. I hope this kind of gives a brief perspective of how we feel as Boilermakers about this blueprint you've created, Brad, and the coalition. Thank you.
Thank you. It's well said, Corey. What you just said, we're hearing echoed by a number of our member unions right now in terms of these priorities. Laurel, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Obviously echo what has been said before, and would like to make sure that as we think and as details are developed in terms of implementing policy, that we're thinking about these communities, not just from a jobs aspect, which is of course crucial and which can benefit communities all across the country because of the diversity of carbon capture options that are available, but also that we think about local environmental benefits. As Jesse said in the introduction, carbon capture solutions are often those which are also capturing and doing something with, either by avoiding combustion or by other means. They're preventing the release of air pollutants, which have been tremendous sources of misery, if I may say so, in communities where some of the industries that most need carbon capture are located. And so folding those elements into policies and into project decision-making will be very important, and a part of bringing the entire community together in support the advancement of these types of projects.
Well, Laurel, you actually very eloquently spoke to what was going to be my second question, which is how do we, as we think about, the development of this new carbon economy and economy-wide deployment of carbon capture, direct air capture, utilization, and other technologies to manage carbon at scale, how do we do it in a way that we improve the conditions, environmental and economic, for the communities that are literally living on the front lines of these various facilities and in industrial regions of our country? So, Colin and then Corey, just give you a chance to maybe briefly add to what Laurel just said.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I really appreciate Laurel's answer. I mean, I think as a former state regulator, we've seen, the way the Clean Air Act kind of addresses criteria pollutants often is looking at them kind of in isolation, right? So like we'll target mercury. So you put a bunch of scrubbers on for mercury, but then you have issues with NOx or, of sulfur dioxide or other heavy metals. And I think, this actually presents an opportunity to kind of think about holistic processes and facilities more holistically, right? I mean, if you're going to make the retrofit to kind of go through a carbon capture kind of massive, kind of reconfiguration in some cases, I mean, that is the time to think through, how you deal with the full kind of suite of kind of impacts on local communities. And we've made incredible strides, right? I mean, if you compare, the average, whether it's an arc furnace today or, the different types of products, I mean, they are significantly cleaner than they were before. We're still living with legacy pollution in a lot of cases in soils and waters and other places. But like, I would argue that this is where I'd love to see public investment. I mean, we are competing against facilities in other countries where government's paying for a lot of the controls or heavily subsidizing in some cases. And so my thing is, how do we get to the cleanest point we possibly can through a combination of investments, incentives, as well as common sense regulations? How do we build into our trade agreements, having those kind of standards, so we're not competing unfairly against other places as you're trying to restore a balance of trade that's has some semblance of actual balance, and at the same time really take to heart the impacts that we have through the ways that we have traditionally produced things. I mean, this is the moment to get at those. And again, this gets back to my 4 historic crises. The technology is all there, and it's a hell of a lot more cost effective to think about dealing with them more comprehensively and kind of holistically at once, as opposed to this bit by bit, kind of death by a thousand cuts regulatory approach we've often taken in the past.
Great, thank you, Colin. Corey, is there anything you'd like to add to that in terms of impacts on communities? And
well, certainly, I think that when we hear about costs, and that's always been a criticism of this technology, carbon capture technology, regardless of its form and what it's doing and utilization, et cetera. But what is the cost of not investing in this technology is the real question. And what will be the ramifications globally if we don't ramp up and have incentives and different tax credits and all different forms of financial support for this technology? I think that's the flavor of the day, rather than focusing on the cost of it. What's the cost of not doing this? Also, we have a very highly skilled workforce out there that, regardless of not just the Boilermaker organizations, but other organizations out there as well, invest millions and millions and millions of dollars of training their members, their workers, to be the best of the best that all they could be, to provide, to be productive and be a safe worker, and also be skilled in installing these different technologies, in particular carbon capture. So it's a wonderful fit, and the tools are there. We just need to act and start to do something about this, because it's time, and there is hope. And this is hope. This technology brings hope. It brings the balance of economy. It brings jobs, and it's everything that people would be looking for. So this is the most sensible approach to mitigating the environmental issues and challenges that we have today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Corey. So we have a final question here before we open it up to questions that are coming in from the audience. And as it's been mentioned earlier, the 45Q tax credit was reformed and expanded in February of 2018. So we're essentially 3 years from that point. And over those 3 years, companies and investors have really dug deep to look at what the opportunities are to deploy these technologies in the marketplace. And what they're finding is that for certain industrial sectors where the costs of capturing CO2 are lower, there's lots of promise for projects, and we'll be hearing more and more about them in the coming months and years. We're also finding, though, that the current values of the 45Q tax credit are not enough for some of these more challenging sectors where the costs are higher. So heavy industry like cement and steel, electric power generation, and direct air capture, where you're trying to capture CO2 from sources where it's not as concentrated and therefore more expensive. So one of the things this blueprint does is looks at how do we fill some of these cost gaps, as Jesse was talking about. So from your perspective, just share a little bit about what you think are some of the most important opportunities to making sure that we're making progress in these really important sectors to reduce emissions and create jobs. Colin, we can start with you if.
Sure. So, sorry, I just didn't want to jump in again. Like, I mean, I think we've learned a lot since 45Q was passed with, one of the great bipartisan coalitions that we've seen on energy issues in the last several years. Obviously, of course, we have to extend it. It really starts there to really encourage longer term investment and so folks can plan. I think the direct pay option that we've talked a lot about is going to be important. I mean, there's just not as much tax appetite as I think we anticipated, just given the tax cuts and the recession that we're in. And so having more of a 1603 kind of grant style is a way to drive. That also drives more value too, because there's this transaction cost loss that ends up resulting. So the money doesn't end up helping workers or the company's bottom line kind of gets whittled down in the transaction. I mean, I'd like to see getting rid of the thresholds. I mean, Shannon from our team does a great job working with the coalition. Has been looking at how do we increase more access to the credit. And so those are a few things, right? I mean, I'd actually argue we should, for at least the time being, we probably shouldn't have limits on the biggest projects because we want to have those and be able to scale up and get to and have more proofs of concept. So again, more certainty leads to more investment, leads to more projects. And then before 45Q, I mean, I think we do see opportunities to target some of the investments. I mean, we'd love to see additional investments in places that have had high unemployment, places that have been hit by coal plant, closures, places that have hit by power plant closure, or coal mine closures, plant closures, places that have had, kind of persistent unemployment challenges in the manufacturing base. And there's some really great conversations going on by Joe Manchin and Debbie Stabenow and others on that right now. But I mean, I think there are some pretty big opportunities, and frankly, as long as we're able to keep that level of bipartisanship, this could be a place that could see, fairly easy. I don't want to say easy because nothing's easy in Congress, but it's easier than most other things that folks are talking about right now.
Great, thanks, Colin. Laurel, you and your team at LanzaTech, you're actually trying to move forward with real world projects in some of what people are calling these hard to abate sectors. Thoughts on what would be especially helpful in expanding on what we've already done in terms of policy looking forward?
Certainly. Yes, you're right. We've got projects in construction around the world in steelmaking, ferroalloy, refining sectors, all of which fall into that hard to abate class. Clearly, as a utilization company, one of the things we would focus on would be things which are barriers to market entry for the products, because of course the difference between utilization and storage is you make money from the product, but only if it can get into the market. So there are, for example, we make fuels. We're also looking at chemicals. There are incentives, existing incentives for fuels, and having EPA first of all, start approving more pathways, look at pathways from CCU. That would be a big accelerator for deployment in the US. It is risky. You have heard throughout risk in building projects, and certainly a number of the measures beyond 45Q that the coalition has been advancing would help to advance projects, such as financing for FEED studies, so that expensive front-end engineering can be co-financed with government support to get a project to the point where private capital will take it forward. The coalition is advocating some improvements in the DOE loan guarantee program. That's another mechanism for reducing project risk. So things like that on the product side and then on the project finance side would all be valuable in terms of deploying here in the US and really building out not just our technology, but the other types of technologies that are ready to go.
Great, thank you, Laurel. Corey, you're obviously based in Canada, but if there's anything you'd like to add specifically in terms of policy priorities, feel free.
Certainly, I think, more people have to put skin in the game. We have to look at all the options and alternatives for investment. And it's these are the same energy industries that help propel us to, the comforts that we enjoy and live in today. So it only makes sense to be supporting them in any way we can. I know in Canada, we've through our pension plan in Canada, we're allowed to take so much money and actually invest it directly into these innovative technologies. So, we're exploring those ideas. So other pension plans in Canada are looking at, following us and doing the same thing. So we hope that we can ignite that from the private sector and do what's right, because it's needed. And again, it's another one of those tools in the toolkit, if you want to say, that is going to help promote growth. And when you put skin in the game and you're investing in these sort of things, it's because you believe in them and you support them. It's also imperative that this again continues in a global perspective as well, and take lessons learned from what other nations are doing. And we're blessed here not far from where where my home is actually, that we built the world's first post-carbon capture plant at the Shand Boundary Dam facility, and it's collecting over 90% of the CO2 emissions. Shell Quest, same thing. Under budget, on time. It's working. And a hidden gem that no one's even really talking about is the Northwest Refinery. It's essentially the world's largest carbon capture facility, and they built the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. So other emitters could, capture and sequester of their CO2 emissions. So yes, I think the investment part's huge. The tax incentive and the tax credit. I mean, Canada's learning some things from what you've adopted in the United States and vice versa, but there's so much sharing that has to go on, because again, this is a world and a global issue. It's not just a US or a Canada issue, but I think the world is really looking towards both of our respective nations to take this leadership role on to manage greenhouse gas emissions, and I think we're going to be able to do that. And our governments, I believe they met yesterday, and there's some very positive news about where we go with this. So I think there's positive stories coming forward.
And Brad, can I pick up one of those threads?
Yeah, please. Absolutely.
I think Laurel's point on the market side, I think, is huge. And we've focused a lot on incentives around the technology side, but I do think, having real predictable incentives on the market, on the use side is going to be important. And I think the federal procurement can be a part of that. I think some of the state level procurements, but, whether it's cement, whether it's fuels, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we probably should be talking about. But I do worry about this valley of death, right, for consumer adoption if we don't have that kind of predictability. And it's similar on the direct air capture side, right? We're trying to have this one size fits all, but we know that's going to require a higher level of incentive given, just kind of the capital needs and the timelines. And so, I mean, maybe, and that's, obviously the blueprint covers a lot of this, but I do think thinking through these kind of arcs of moving from technologies to actual markets, it does require kind of a different type of thinking than we've had so far.
Absolutely. Thanks, Colin. And just making sure that even with existing policies that there's full eligibility for the technologies and products they're producing to participate in addition to new policy is important. So while we still have time, I want to make sure that we shift over, and we've been getting some questions coming in. Jesse, I'll turn it over to you because you've been monitoring the questions, and there may be some that you can combine depending. And I think some of them are directed to individual panelists. So feel free, Jesse.
Sure, yeah. I'd actually like to start with a sort of a more general question for everyone, which is the coalition is very diverse, and we've all talked a little bit about that, yet we're able to reach consensus on many issues. And wondering for you and your organization, how does that translate to policy advocacy around these issues on Capitol Hill?
I mean, I'll jump in. Like, I mean, there's nothing more fun than going up on the hill with like strange bedfellows, right? I mean, like when you can walk into a senator's office, say, Senator Brasso's office or Senator Whitehouse's office, or, Senator Hoeven or whoever the case may be. And you have, folks from heavy industry together with labor, with, environmental groups. They know there's something special. They kind of look at you sideways for the first 3 or 4 minutes, right? And then all of a sudden, you get down to it. And that's why this coalition, I would argue, has been one of the most effective policy coalitions over the last few years on the Hill. I mean, this was incredibly rough sledding, right? I mean, like the landscape that we've been trying to move things in, but the fact that so many bills have moved, and again, there's some things that should have gotten done that didn't quite get through the House last time. But I mean, I think the diversity is a strength, and I think if anything, we can continue to broaden even further, particularly as we're addressing some of the frontline issues that I think have been harder to talk about, but I think we need to talk about more and more. This coalition has got nothing but even more potential to be bigger and more robust.
And if I might add, I think the point about advocacy and actually, being able to present such a diverse coalition during advocacy, of course, is crucial. I think it's actually even more important that this is a forum for divergent and diverse points of view to be articulated and discussed in advance. That is, by having so many different points of view represented within the coalition, we're able to hear perspectives that none of us would necessarily individually have been able to understand. And it allows us to shape policies and recommendations through consensus that are things we can all stand behind. And that's an enormous strength.
Great, thank you. Laurel, this is a question actually for you. Could you talk specifically about the volumes of CO2 that you think could be utilized on an annual basis across a range of products? And I would add, specifically for LanzaTech, can you elaborate on, what are the volumes that you're exploring in terms of utilization for the end products that you're looking at specifically?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm not armed with good numbers overall, right? And probably what I could say that would just give an indication of magnitude is that as we look at gas streams that are, so these are just industrial emissions and just streams that would be suitable for our technology, and translate that into a single product, ethanol, which can be, as I said earlier, it can itself be a platform into, say, plastics or fuels. We would project we could produce 30 billion gallons of ethanol from industrial gases in the US with the technology that we have today. So that just gives an order of magnitude of opportunity. One process, a subset of industrial emissions, that's twice the volume produced in our conventional ethanol industry today in the US.
Great, thank you. And there is a little bit in the blueprint about the potential. I know some organizations have tried to identify what the potential there is. It is very hard to kind of land on some of those numbers for some of these very nascent sectors. Colin, we received a question on the role of CCUS in addressing environmental justice and energy equity issues. I know you've teed this up a bit earlier in your remarks, but is there anything you'd like to elaborate on that point specifically?
Look, I mean, I think one thing that I'd like to just kind of share with everybody watching right now is that the lack of engagement of frontline communities that have been impacted by polluting facilities for generations has made it harder in some cases to promote the benefits of carbon capture technology because the trust isn't there. And so I would just encourage folks that are on the corporate side, in particular on this call, to think about how they engage their local communities. And look, when folks are concerned about health, right? Folks are concerned about kids with asthma and lead in water, right? And legacy PCBs in soils, right? I mean, I think there's an honesty that we have to have, and in a time of global capital and many companies being headquartered in other places, and some of these facilities being older. It's easy to lose sight of the folks that are on the other side of the fence line when folks are just thinking about the next quarterly earnings and hoping to keep the facility open. But we got to do better. When you know better, do better. And I think this coalition in particular is incredibly privileged to have some of the world's leading companies as part of it. Many of whom have done remarkable things to reduce their impacts and their footprint. But many of whom still, obviously affect communities as well. And so I'd love to be part of that conversation. I think, more of the CEOs probably need to be. But I think we gotta authentically engage and show how we can meet health goals and carbon goals and other goals all simultaneously.
Great, thank you. I know we're talking about federal policy here today, but there is an important role for our local leaders and state leaders to play. And so a question for all of you is, what is the role of state governments in supporting advancement of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies?
Certainly, I think it's already been mentioned that state governments have a procurement role, procurement function, which can certainly be leveraged to move forward products into the market. State governments also play a crucial role in approvals of projects. And so paying specific attention to how to facilitate permitting and other approvals for new projects, not in a way that undermines their qualifications, but simply removes bureaucracy, perhaps provides a focused function which would support carbon capture projects. That's the kind of thing that's well within a state's purview and actually wouldn't be costly for states to implement.
Yeah, the only thing I would add too is that, as a former state guy, I'm always the state advocate. I think there's a connective tissue, right? You look at what the state of Wyoming's been able to do, right? Where amazing research at the university combined with strong relationships with companies, combined with really smart, efficient permitting programs, combined with bringing in, incredible federal resources through Senator Brasso's leadership. That connectivity, especially in a smaller state where you can actually get everybody around the table and kind of come up with, ways to have these centers of excellence. And Laurel's point on the permitting is exactly right. But I do think, I think states that move out, in fairly aggressive ways to try to both be innovators, but also early deployers of technology are gonna reap the benefits for years. And so, I think I think states are a perfect laboratory of innovation or laboratory of democracy to do a lot of this work and hopefully have the best ideas and scale up to even better federal policy.
Thank you both. Well, I think we are almost out of time. I will take the last question, which is a really easy question, which was, when will the policy blueprint be available on your website? It already is. So you go to carbon-capture-coalition.org and you can find our blueprint there in PDF form. So I'll hand it back to Brad for any closing remarks, but just want to thank everyone for joining us here today.
Thanks, Jesse. And I really just want to echo Jesse's thanks to all three of you for taking the time. We really value your participation, engagement, and your passion for this policy agenda and involvement in the coalition. It's folks like you that have contributed to the successes we've been talking about and can help us accomplish this ambitious agenda we have in front of us. I also want to thank everybody in the audience. We had a really great turnout today. We appreciate all of you joining us. And I know that we have many partners and hopefully some potential allies in the audience, and would encourage all of you who are interested to reach out if you're inspired to get involved and help support carbon capture agenda going forward. So thanks again, everyone, and really appreciate you joining us. Take care.